The rights and responsibilities of immigrant workers and the Transcontinental Railroad. The Transcontinental Railroad was an innovative piece of infrastructure that affected the United States and sparked expansion and development. The United States could not be where it is today without the immigrant workers who put their time and effort into building the Transcontinental Railroad for America. There was a lot of inequality toward immigrants during the building of the Transcontinental Railroad in the late 1800s. Immigrant workers that helped to establish America's first transcontinental railroad had their rights abused, as well as a myriad of strenuous responsibilities.
Ever since the Chinese began to come and go to the Pacific coast, there has been more or less ill feeling towards them both in cities and towns, and most this feeling was purely one of dislike. The appearance, habits, customs, and non-assimilated character of the race were objected to.
The Transcontinental Railroad workers experienced inequality and racial discrimination, yet were responsible for many perilous tasks. The Transcontinental Railroad was influenced by westward expansion. From the creation of steel, rails could be made to transport goods as well as humans, long distances in shorter amounts of time. When the Pacific Railway Act of 1862 was passed, it gave companies sections of land to lay a rail across. With this, thousands of workers were needed if the railroad were to be built in only a few years. Many immigrants were hired, as they worked for low wage. The immigrant workers mostly consisted of the Chinese by the Central Pacific and the Irish by the Union Pacific.
The Chinese companies found it extremely profitable to pay the expenses of these laborers to America. For work here was plenty, labor was scarce, and extravagantly high.
By the time in which the railroad was completed, around 15,000 Chinese laborers were employed by the Central Pacific. In all, about 80% of the workers who helped to build the Transcontinental Railroad were immigrants. The immigrant employees had to deal with harsh working conditions during the building of the Transcontinental Railroad. The immigrants woke at sunrise and had to work at least 12 hours a day, 6 days a week in non-stop working conditions and weather conditions. This shows how they were dedicated to their work yet fatigued by sundown.
It is also true of them that they are willing to do a class of work the white men of the coast are unwilling to do, and for which other labor cannot be got.
Workers also had to complete dangerous and risky tasks, such as marking spots, clearing the way for the railroad, using explosives that could make space, laying rails, and hammering in spikes.
So you had lots of men working to move heavy pieces of equipment. The heavy pieces of equipment, they would drop them on their legs, on their feet, they would crush their hands, they could be killed as equipment rolled or fell off of a car. If the loads were not properly tied down, fell off the car, it killed people.
Sometimes, the land was tricky to work on, such as when the employees built over and through mountainous terrain. Of all the responsibilities the workers had, many were dangerous as they were in fluctuating working conditions. As time went on, additional workers were needed to complete the railroad. They would work for mostly any wage and in most conditions. Yet, the white immigrant workers, such as the Irish, were treated as a higher class and were paid more.
The rights were very simple. If you want a paycheck at the end of the week, you're going to do ABC. If you don't do ABC for me, I'm not going to give you the money. And I may fire you because there's somebody else that can come in and do your work.
Chinese workers who were working on the railroad were paid $25 to $40 a month, and the white workers were paid $45 or more.
Asian workers were discriminated against and were paid less than other workers. The railroad labor pay scales were highest for native-born white workers, slightly less for European immigrants, and still less for Asians, Mexicans, and African Americans.
The Chinese workers had to pay for their own food and shelter, while the white and Irish had their food and shelter provided. The Chinese workers had faced prejudice while the Irish and white were treated fairly. The Transcontinental Railroad workers encountered complications with Native Americans. Many attacks and ambushes by the Native Americans took place while the immigrants were working on the railroad.
The company suffered bloody attacks on its workers by Native Americans because the natives threatened the progress of the white man and his iron horse across their native lands.
The workers had to fight off Native Americans because they did not accept the fact of ownership of land by the white man.
the idea of someone owning a piece of the property that they lived on, and because they quote-unquote owned it, they could put a railroad track across it and tell those Native Americans, to tell those Indians to stay off of it, was completely foreign to them. And as the railroad moved west through those lands, the Indians fought back.
The managers who overlooked the building of the railroad didn't value the immigrant workers. They thought of the workers as offbeat and irregular. No Asian workers were included in the historic photograph of the Golden Spike when the railroad was done being built. The managers did not care about the workers and wanted the whole world to be convinced that America is powerful by itself. From this, we can conclude that immigrants were hired just because they were needed, and the managers did not see through to the true importance of them.
The strong points of the Chinese are that they work very hard for 1/2 to 1/3 less wages than the other nationalities.
From this, we can once again see that the managers of the railroad companies did not care for the workers. The employers who hired the immigrant workers did not come to sense of understanding yet the great impact of the immigrant workers made in American history. Besides working in harsh and dangerous conditions, the workers basically only had one other factor tied into their responsibilities: making enough money each week to pay for their own personal expenses. Dilapidated settlements erected along the tracks of the progressing railroad construction. These settlements influenced drinking, gambling, prostitution, and violence for the workers. Hell-on-wheels settlements, as they called them, became very common within the workers.
To pay for good lodgings and his desire to live with those of his own race, his opium would be just wherever he is.
The railroad workers were paid, and at the end of every week, they needed something to spend their money on. So this group of individuals, people who sold alcohol, who sold supplies, who sold drugs, who set up gambling, prostitution, this entire industry of parasitic individuals came together and followed the railroad westward and relieved the hard workers of their money, gave them pleasure, and it set up a whole new industry.
The workers found themselves wasting their money on unessential things. Therefore, they could not fulfill their responsibility of keeping enough money to support themselves. A handful of them would seem to even spend money faster than they earned it. Immigrant workers that helped to establish America's first Transcontinental Railroad had their rights abused, as well as a myriad of strenuous responsibilities. The workers fulfilled their many responsibilities and dealt with the small amount of rights they actually had. The workers had made a way for people in the West to trade to the people in the East, and the East to trade with the West, but it came with a cost for the workers. Many of the workers died because of disease and dangerous accidents. In the end, none of the immigrant workers ended up getting paid back what they deserved. After the railroad was completed, many of the Chinese immigrants moved to the West Coast, while many of the Irish workers moved to the East Coast. Even today, the West Coast is densely populated with Chinese who are descendants of the workers who helped build the Transcontinental Railroad.
Many of them stayed on the West Coast and throughout the heartland of America. As the Transcontinental Railroad was being built, the project had a great deal of support from the American government. So land grants were given to the railroads by the government, free land grants, specifically with the idea that the railroad would be constructed by these companies, and to make it worthwhile, the companies would set up towns through the prairies into the mountains to the West Coast to encourage people to move from the coasts and fill in the rest of the country.
Without the immigrant workers who helped to establish America's first Transcontinental Railroad, we would not be as economically advanced of a country as we are today.